Mike Tyson had seen his neighbor almost every morning since he moved in, a quiet, older man who took slow walks with his little dog, sometimes stopping to trim the bushes in his front yard, sometimes just sitting on his porch, watching the world go by. But lately, the house next door had been too quiet. No early morning walks. No dog barking. No sign of movement behind the windows. At first, Mike thought maybe the man had gone on a trip, maybe was staying with family, maybe it was nothing. But after a few more days of silence, he found himself standing on the porch next door, knocking on the door, waiting. And when the door finally opened, he knew something wasn't right. The man looked thinner, a little paler, his expression carrying that quiet weight of someone who didn't want to ask for help but might need it anyway. And when Mike asked how he was doing, the answer wasn't in the words, but in the way the old man hesitated before saying them. This wasn't just a quiet week. Something had changed. Mike had gotten used to the little routines of his neighborhood, early mornings where the sun was just starting to stretch across the pavement, the quiet hum of sprinklers coming to life, and the familiar sight of his elderly neighbor shuffling down the sidewalk with his small dog trotting beside him. The man wasn't much of a talker, but he always gave a nod, always had a moment to stop and adjust the leash or wave at a passing car. Some days, Mike would see him trimming the bushes in his front yard, moving slower than he probably wanted to, but still moving, still out there. And then, one morning, he wasn't. At first, Mike didn't think much of it. People took breaks. Maybe the guy had an appointment, maybe the dog was feeling lazy, maybe he was just tired. But as the days passed, the porch stayed empty, the curtains in the windows never shifted, and the once well-kept yard started to look a little too still, like nobody had stepped outside in days. Mike wasn't the type to stick his nose where it didn't belong. He knew the unspoken rules of neighborly relationships, nods in passing, casual small talk about the weather, maybe an occasional favor if it was needed, but never pushing too far. But there was something about the silence next door that didn't sit right with him, something about the way the yard, once neatly trimmed, had started looking abandoned, something about the fact that the little dog he used to see walking around every morning hadn't shown up for over a week. It wasn't just a missed walk. It wasn't just a lazy weekend. It was different. And different, in Mike's experience, usually meant something was wrong. So now, standing on the porch of the house next door, his hand hovering over the wood of the door, he hesitated, not because he was unsure of what to say, but because he knew that once he knocked, the moment would change. The man inside would either confirm his suspicions or brush them off, but either way, things wouldn't be the same. He exhaled, shifted his weight slightly, and knocked. The sound of his knuckles against the door felt louder than it should have. It wasn't an aggressive knock, just firm enough to be heard, but in the stillness of the late afternoon, it echoed against the walls of the porch. Mike waited, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No shifting inside. No dog barking. He knocked again, this time slightly louder, and took a step back, his eyes moving across the front of the house, looking for any sign of movement behind the curtains. Still nothing. The uneasy feeling in his gut twisted a little tighter. There was always the chance that the man wasn't home, that he was staying with family, that this was all in Mike's head. But something about the silence didn't feel like absence, it felt like waiting. Just as Mike was about to turn around, as he was already telling himself he'd come back later, he heard it, the slow, deliberate slide of a lock being undone. The door cracked open just an inch at first, just enough for an eye to peek through, and then, with visible effort, it swung open enough for the man to step into the light. Mike hadn't been sure what to expect, but the sight in front of him wasn't it. The old man looked thinner than before, his face slightly hollowed out, his skin paler, his posture not the same quiet confidence he used to carry, but something different, something slower, something careful. His clothes, once always neatly pressed, looked a little wrinkled, like he had stopped caring about the little details. And more than anything, it was in the way he stood, not relaxed, not open, but like he was leaning against the doorway not just for support, but because he needed it. Mike kept his voice steady, casual, like this was just another passing conversation, just another day. "Hey, man. I was just wondering if you were all right. Haven't seen you outside in a while." The old man blinked, like the question had caught him off guard, like he hadn't even considered that someone might notice his absence. His lips parted slightly, as if he was about to brush it off, but he hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for Mike to see the flicker of truth behind his expression before he forced a weak smile. "Yeah," the man muttered, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't spoken much lately. "Just been staying in." Mike had been around too many fighters, too many tough guys, too many people who hated asking for help to not recognize what was happening. The old man wasn't lying, not exactly, but he wasn't telling the truth either. There was something beneath the surface, something unsaid, something he wasn't ready to put into words. Mike didn't push. He just tilted his head slightly, glancing past the man into the house, and that's when he saw it, the cane, broken, leaning against the wall near the couch, the wood split clean in the middle, useless. And suddenly, everything made sense. "Had a little fall last week," the old man admitted, following Mike's gaze. "Didn't break anything, just banged up my knee. But my damn cane snapped when I went down, and he trailed off, cleared his throat. Haven't gotten around to ordering a new one." Mike exhaled through his nose. He knew that tone, knew that carefully chosen way of speaking, where words were measured just enough to make it sound like something small, something manageable, something that didn't need anyone else's involvement. He also knew that wasn't the truth. The man hadn't left his house in a week. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. And instead of asking for help, he had just stayed inside. Mike could have argued, could have pointed out how stubborn it was to sit around waiting when a simple fix existed, but he didn't. He just nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world, like he wasn't about to do exactly what needed to be done. "All right," he said simply, stepping back from the doorway. "I'll check in later." The old man didn't protest, didn't try to convince him otherwise, just gave a small nod before slowly closing the door. But Mike wasn't going home. He was going to fix this. Mike had never bought a cane before. As he walked into the nearest pharmacy, scanning the aisles, he realized just how many options there were, adjustable ones, lightweight ones, ones with different grips. But he knew one thing, he wasn't going to buy some cheap, flimsy thing that would snap under pressure. So he took his time, feeling the weight of each one, testing the handles, making sure it was something solid, something dependable. Eventually, he found it, a sturdy wooden cane, classic, strong, the kind that wouldn't fail when it was needed most. And then, just as he was about to leave, he spotted something else by the register. A box of chocolates. Something about it made sense. The old man looked like someone who might have a sweet tooth, but never admitted it. Mike grabbed the box, tossed it onto the counter without a second thought, and paid. When Mike knocked again an hour later, the old man opened the door faster this time, like he had been expecting him. His eyes flickered to the cane in Mike's hand, and before he could start saying something about how that wasn't necessary, Mike just held it out. "Figured you could use this," he said, his voice casual, leaving no room for argument. The old man stared at it for a moment, then reached out and took it. He didn't speak right away, just ran his fingers along the wood, feeling the weight of it, testing it slightly against the floor. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, this'll do." And then Mike handed him the box of chocolates. "For the pain," he said with a smirk. For a second, the old man just looked at it, then let out a short chuckle, the first real laugh Mike had seen from him since he opened the door. The next morning, as Mike stepped outside with his coffee, he glanced toward the house next door. And there he was. The old man, standing on his porch, his little dog circling around his feet, leaning slightly on his new cane but standing tall. He saw Mike watching and lifted a hand in a small wave. Mike just nodded back, took a sip of his coffee, and let the moment be exactly what it was, simple, quiet, and exactly right. Mike had seen houses like this before, not abandoned, not broken, but just still. The kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like time had slowed down inside. The curtains barely shifted, the air inside looked untouched, and even the dog, which used to bark excitedly at every squirrel that passed, was now lying near the couch, silent, waiting. It wasn't just a home anymore, it was a place where movement had stopped. And Mike knew, without needing to be told, that the old man hadn't chosen to stay inside. Something had kept him there. Mike's eyes fell on the broken cane leaning against the wall. It wasn't just snapped, it looked like it had been through something. The split in the wood was clean but deep, like it had given out all at once, no slow break, no warning. It must have happened suddenly. And that meant when it broke, the old man had fallen. The thought made Mike shift slightly on his feet. Falling wasn't the same when you were young. When you were older, a fall wasn't just something you got up from, it was something that could change everything. It could take away your confidence, make you doubt yourself, make you stop trusting your own legs. And if that happened, if a person started believing they couldn't move safely, sometimes they just stopped trying. Mike had spent years around men who didn't like asking for help. Fighters, trainers, old school guys who believed that admitting you needed something was the same as admitting weakness. And as he looked at the old man, standing there in the doorway, eyes flicking between Mike and the broken cane, he saw that same look, the quiet battle between pride and reality. The old man had fallen. He needed a cane to walk properly. And yet, instead of going out and replacing it, instead of calling someone, instead of fixing the problem, he had stayed inside. Not because he wanted to, but because sometimes, when you had spent your whole life doing things on your own, the hardest thing wasn't falling, it was letting someone help you stand up again. "I've been meaning to get a new one," the old man muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just haven't gotten around to it." Mike had heard those kinds of words before, the kind that weren't quite lies, but weren't exactly the truth either. People said things like that when they didn't want to admit that something had become bigger than they thought it would. Mike didn't call him out on it, didn't push, just let the words settle in the air. He knew that people needed to come to terms with things on their own. But what he also knew was that if he left now, if he let the conversation end here, the man wasn't going to go out and fix it himself. He was going to keep waiting. Mike had always believed that there were moments in life where you asked people what they needed, and then there were moments where you didn't. This wasn't a moment for asking. It wasn't a moment for giving the man an option. So Mike just nodded, like the conversation was over, like there was nothing more to be said, and took a small step back. "All right," he said simply. "I'll check in later." The old man didn't argue, didn't try to stop him. But in his eyes, Mike could already see it, that mix of reluctance and relief, the kind that came when someone realized that, for once, they didn't have to figure it out on their own. Mike didn't rush. He walked to his car like it was just another errand, just another normal day. But the whole time, he was already running through his next steps. The old man wasn't going to ask for help. That much was clear. And if Mike had learned anything from his own life, from his own experiences, it was that sometimes, the best way to help someone wasn't to wait for them to ask, it was to see what they needed and just do it. No debates. No discussions. Just action. He started the car, backed out of the driveway, and headed straight for the nearest pharmacy. Mike had never shopped for a cane before, and as he walked into the store, he realized just how many options there were: foldable ones, lightweight ones, ones with rubber grips, ones that adjusted in height. But he wasn't looking for something flashy. He was looking for something dependable. Something solid. Something that wouldn't snap in half when it was needed most. His fingers ran along the different handles, testing the weight, the grip, until he found the right one, a classic wooden cane, strong, reliable, the kind that felt like it had been built to last. He picked it up, felt its weight in his hands, and knew immediately that this was the one. As he walked toward the register, something caught his eye, a box of chocolates sitting near the counter. The fancy kind, the kind wrapped in gold foil, the kind that older folks always seemed to have sitting in their kitchens. He wasn't sure why, but he grabbed the box, tossing it onto the counter along with the cane. Maybe it was because he had a feeling the old man could use something small to remind him that life wasn't just about getting through the day. Sometimes, it was about the little things. The things that made the day feel a little bit better, a little bit easier. When Mike returned an hour later, the old man opened the door faster this time, like he had been expecting him. His eyes flickered to the cane in Mike's hand, and before he could start saying something about how it wasn't necessary, Mike just held it out. "Figured you could use this," he said, his voice casual, leaving no room for argument. The old man stared at it for a moment before reaching out and taking it, his fingers running over the smooth wood, testing its weight against the floor. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, this'll do." And then Mike handed him the box of chocolates. "For the pain," he said with a smirk. For a second, the old man just looked at the chocolates, then back at Mike, and let out a chuckle, a real laugh, not forced, not out of politeness, but the kind that comes when someone realizes they don't have to carry everything on their own. Mike didn't say anything else, just nodded and stepped back. "See you around," he said before turning away. And as he walked back toward his house, he could feel it, that quiet shift, the kind that wasn't about grand gestures or big moments, but about something simpler, something quieter. The kind of thing that reminded a person they weren't invisible. Mike had driven this road 100 times before, past these same streetlights, turned at these same intersections, but this time felt different. The engine hummed steadily beneath him, the weight of the conversation with his neighbor still lingering in the back of his mind. He wasn't rushing, wasn't pressing harder on the gas, but there was a certain energy to his movement, an unspoken urgency that came not from the need to be fast, but from the knowledge that this was something that needed to be done, something that shouldn't be put off for later. Because later was how people like his neighbor got stuck. Later was how people told themselves they'd handle it when they had the time, handle it when it became a priority, handle it when it was absolutely necessary, until suddenly, later had turned into weeks spent inside, waiting for a problem to fix itself. When he stepped inside the pharmacy, the bright fluorescent lights felt too harsh after the fading glow of the evening outside, the kind of artificial brightness that made everything look too sharp, too clinical, too impersonal. The aisle stretched out in front of him, rows of neatly arranged products, shelves lined with everything from bandages to vitamins to things people only bought when they absolutely had to. Mike moved with purpose, walking past the customers who were here for small, forgettable errands, grabbing toothpaste, picking up prescriptions, scanning the shelves for something they didn't really need. But for him, this wasn't just another errand. He wasn't here out of convenience. He was here to fix something. The canes were tucked away in a quiet corner of the store, lined up neatly like they were waiting for someone who didn't want to admit they needed them. They came in different styles, some sleek and modern, some lightweight and collapsible, some built for function more than comfort. Mike ran his fingers along the different handles, feeling the cool metal, the textured grips, the polished wood. He wasn't just looking for something that worked. He was looking for something that felt right. Something that had weight to it, something that wouldn't feel like a fragile afterthought. The old man's cane had snapped clean in half. That wasn't going to happen again. He picked up one of the heavier canes, turned it over in his hands, tested the balance of it. The wood was thick, smooth, polished to a dark finish, the kind of cane that looked like it had been built to last, not just something mass-produced and flimsy. He gripped the handle, pressed down slightly, feeling how it resisted, how it held its ground. This was the one. It wasn't flashy, wasn't overcomplicated. It was solid, dependable, reliable, and that was all that mattered. As he turned toward the register, his eyes landed on a display near the counter, rows of neatly stacked boxes wrapped in golden foil, chocolates arranged in perfect rows, the kind of thing that felt like a small luxury, something simple but meaningful. He didn't stop to think about it. Just reached out, grabbed one, and placed it alongside the cane. Because it wasn't just about fixing the problem. It was about reminding the old man that he still deserved something more than just the bare minimum. That life wasn't just about getting by, about enduring, about waiting for things to get better. Sometimes, it was about something as small as a box of chocolates. The girl behind the counter barely looked up at first, scanning the cane and the chocolates with the same mechanical rhythm she probably used for every customer. But then, as she bagged the items, she hesitated for just a second, glancing up at Mike with curiosity, maybe trying to piece together the connection between the two purchases. "That's a nice cane," she said casually, her tone light but inquisitive, like she wanted to ask but knew better than to pry. Mike just nodded. "It's for a friend." She didn't push, didn't ask for details, just handed him the bag with a small smile, a different kind of understanding passing between them. Some things didn't need to be explained. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the bag resting on the seat beside him, there was a different kind of quiet in the car now, not the heavy, unsettled kind that had followed him earlier, but something lighter, something steadier. This wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about charity. It was about doing what needed to be done, about making sure someone who had spent his life taking care of himself didn't have to fight through one more thing alone. When he pulled into his driveway, he glanced toward the old man's house, half expecting it to still be dark, still be motionless. But this time, the curtains weren't completely drawn. There was a faint glow from inside, the soft yellow of a lamp casting a sliver of light through the window. It wasn't much, but it was something. Mike grabbed the bag, stepped out of the car, and headed toward the porch without hesitation. When he knocked this time, there was no long pause, no hesitation, no quiet wait filled with uncertainty. The door opened a few seconds later, and the old man stood there, looking at Mike, then at the bag in his hand, then back at Mike again. His expression was unreadable at first, somewhere between surprise and something deeper, something harder to define. Mike didn't explain. Just reached out and handed him the cane. "Figured you could use this," he said simply. The old man took it, running his fingers over the smooth wood, testing the weight of it like he was trying to convince himself it was real. And then, before he could say anything, Mike held out the box of chocolates. "For the pain," he added with a smirk. The old man let out a small chuckle, quiet but real. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "You don't mess around, do you?" Mike just shrugged, stepping back slightly, already turning toward his own house. "See you around," he said, like it was nothing, like this was just another normal exchange, another small part of an ordinary day. The old man didn't say anything right away. Just stood there for a moment, looking at the cane, at the chocolates, then at Mike again. And then, with a slow nod, he finally spoke. "Yeah. See you around." The next morning, Mike didn't expect anything to be different. People didn't change overnight, especially when they had spent years doing things their own way. But as he stepped outside with his morning coffee, stretching slightly as he took in the crisp air, something caught his eye, movement on the porch next door. The old man wasn't walking yet, wasn't fully back to his routine, but he was standing, leaning slightly on the cane Mike had given him, letting the weight of it settle under his grip. His little dog trotted in circles around his feet, sniffing the steps like it hadn't been outside in weeks, and for the first time in a long time, the house didn't look abandoned. Mike didn't say anything. Didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't turn the moment into something bigger than it needed to be. He just stood there, sipping his coffee, letting the old man feel like this was his own decision, like stepping onto the porch wasn't about proving anything to anyone but himself. And after a few minutes, the old man glanced up, saw Mike watching, and gave him a small nod. Mike returned the gesture, took another sip of coffee, and let the moment be exactly what it was, simple, quiet, and enough. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Each morning, Mike would step outside with his coffee, and each morning, the old man would be there, not always at the same time, not always doing much, but there. Some days, he'd just sit on the porch, letting the morning air wake him up. Other days, he'd move a little more, testing his balance, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. They never talked about it. Mike didn't ask how he was feeling, didn't ask if the cane was working out, didn't push for any kind of acknowledgement. Because some things didn't need to be said. The old man was outside again. That was enough. One morning, though, as Mike stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the cool air, he caught something new, a sound he hadn't heard in a long time. The old man was laughing. He was on the steps, leaning down to scratch behind his dog's ears, shaking his head at something the little mutt had done. It was quiet, almost lost in the breeze, but it was real. And Mike found himself smiling before he even realized it. One afternoon, as Mike was getting back from a run, he noticed something waiting for him on his doorstep, a small, plain box with a note taped to the top. He picked it up, recognizing the careful, slightly shaky handwriting before he even read the words. "You looked out for me. Figured I'd return the favor. Try not to eat them all at once." Mike opened the box and let out a quiet chuckle. Chocolates. The same kind he had given the old man that night on his doorstep. He glanced toward the neighbor's house and saw the old man sitting there, pretending not to be watching. Mike lifted the box slightly, a wordless thanks. The old man just nodded, took a slow sip of his tea, and went back to looking out at the street, like nothing had happened. But Mike knew better. The next day was the same as the others. Mike stepped outside with his coffee. The old man was on his porch with his tea. The dog sniffed around in the yard. The world moved like it always had, like it hadn't changed at all. But it had. Because sometimes, change doesn't come in big, dramatic moments. Sometimes, it's in the small things, the quiet nods, the morning routines, the way someone who had once disappeared from the world slowly starts stepping back into it. Mike didn't need to say anything. The old man didn't either. They just sat there, in their own spaces, in their own ways, knowing that some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood.